Dr. Osborne with Web Wellness University, and today I want to talk a little bit about migraine headache triggers. Migraine triggers are extremely common as it relates to the diet, as it relates to chemicals found in food and chemicals found in the environment. But unfortunately, very few doctors will actually have this type of conversation with a patient. Somebody comes in with a migraine, the typical solution is either over the counter or pain reductive medicines, prescriptive medicines to try to prevent or to try to reduce the pain. But little is done to actually stop the trigger, stop the inflammation. So want to go through, created a diagram for you to kind of go through some of the real super common triggers of migraine headache. So let's start down here at the bottom. We've got processed foods. Processed foods, super common. And more specifically, it's processed foods because of what's in processed foods. A number of different things that are on this wheel, that are on this list, are actually also in processed foods. So for example, MSG, which we see up here on the wheel, artificial sweeteners, which we see here, foods that can mimic or disrupt hormones, things like pesticides, very, very common to find those in highly processed foods. Corn syrup is another example. Corn syrups can also contain mercury, which is a toxin that can trigger neurological migraine headaches. So heavy metals in rice, which are highly found highly in a lot of different types of processed foods. So cadmium, arsenic, those types of things. So processed food, one very, very major trigger migraine headache. If you're a migraineur and you're chronically suffering with headaches and medicine's not working very well and you're trying to figure this out, my advice, eat real food, eat whole foods. Now, number two, muscle aches. Now, a lot of people don't think that muscle tension will actually trigger a migraine because they're thinking of like tension headaches instead of migraine headaches. Well, we're talking about how muscle spasms in the neck, the base of the skull, can actually be a preceding trigger for a migraine. It's not the cause, but it's sometimes the proverbial straw that breaks the camel's back, if you will. So chronic muscle aches and pains, so somebody who sits at a desk all day and somebody who's very sedentary, somebody who's looking close at small screens, and triggering chronic muscular tension in the shoulders and the neck, this can be a real strong trigger for migraine headaches. So taking periodic breaks from the workload, stretching the neck out, performing exercises, calisthenics, yoga, things of that nature might help and go a long way toward reducing the migraine-based triggers. Stress is a big one. Stress is a lot like caffeine, and you can see caffeine is also on this wheel. Stress and caffeine, one of the effects that they both do is they cause hormonal fluctuations that can lead to elevations and reductions in blood sugar levels. So we can get hyper and hypoglycemic swings that can trigger migraine headaches. But stress also triggers adrenaline release, as does caffeine. Both can trigger an adrenaline release from the adrenal glands, which can affect the way the blood vessels dilate that feed your brain. And this is actually known to be one of the major triggers, is an oxygen deprivation or a blood loss deprivation going into brain cells. And again, that's a very, very common trigger for migraine headache. Sugar. I mentioned earlier corn sugar for several reasons. One, the blood sugar fluctuations are a trigger for migraine headache, so eating a lot of processed sugar can be a problem. Now, I'm not talking about fruit. I'm not talking about pineapples and bananas and apples and things of that nature. I'm talking more specifically here about processed sugar. So again, if you're suffering with migraine headaches, get the sugar out of the diet. Environmental stress. So we've got stress and then we've got environmental stress. So there are a number of different forms of stress. There's physical stress, there's mental stress, there's emotional stress, there's environmental stressors that can be triggers. So perfect example of environmental stress is, going to work in an environment that you don't like every day, having a boss you don't like or coworkers that you don't like, and being subjected and surrounded by that every single day. You know, that tends to burden and bear on a person, and that chronic long-term stress can actually elevate your blood pressure. And those elevations in blood pressure are going to make it harder to deliver oxygen to your brain, and that in and of itself is a trigger for migraine headaches. Artificial sweeteners. It's been actually quite well studied. Artificial sweeteners, particularly like saccharin and aspartame and sulfame K, these are neurotoxins, and they are known migraine triggers, where people are going to find these oftentimes in chewing gum and mouthwash and toothpaste. You also find them in candies and sodas and other things. So again, there's a lot of overlap in a lot of these triggers. So again, going back to avoiding processed sugars, avoiding processed foods, avoiding things with added chemicals added to them is going to go a long way toward helping you eradicate migraine headaches. The next on the list, MSG. MSG short or an acronym for monosodium glutamate, which is monosodium glutamate is it's a neuro trigger, meaning it's a neurostimulation trigger. It's a salt substitute, so it's commonly found in soy sauce. It's commonly found in things like Chinese food. Commonly found in restaurant food. You know, a lot of meat tenderizers and salad dressings. And again, flavor enhancers for food will commonly contain MSG. So flip it over, read the label. Chocolate, and I'm going to combine here chocolate and coffee. Even though coffee's not on the wheel, if you consume heavy quantities of either one, they can both be migraine triggers. And one of the big reasons why is that they both contain caffeine, high levels of caffeine. And as you see down here, caffeine is one of those components on the chart as well. And again, that has to do with the influx. Caffeine creates basically it creates an adrenal burst, so it causes your adrenal glands to oversecrete adrenaline, which can trigger vasodilation, vasoconstriction, which is the known trigger for migraine headaches. But in addition to that, the chocolate, the coffee will potentiate blood sugar swings. So kind of going back to what we were talking about before. Nutritional deficiencies, probably one that very few people talk about. Vitamin B12, CoQ10, vitamin B2, iron, vitamin E, vitamin C. These are all potential vitamins, minerals that can, when deficient, can be triggers for migraine headaches because they either play a role in the oxidative process in the body, which the oxidative process, basically an anti-inflammatory parameter of these vitamins, help to stabilize inflammation, and inflammation is a known trigger. But in addition, some of these nutrients are electrolytes, so they help to control the vasodilation of your blood vessels, and they also help control neurological messaging. So oftentimes people have vitamin and mineral deficiencies. They don't even know about it because most doctors don't test for it. And it really is sometimes as simple as supplementing with vitamin B12 or iron or magnesium. So have your doctor check for nutritional deficiencies using advanced testing to help you identify those things so you can rule them out. Now, on the same note, remember that a number of medications will actually cause vitamin and mineral deficiencies. So if you're on a statin to lower cholesterol, statins cause CoQ10 deficiency. If you're on diabetic medication, those also cause CoQ10 and vitamin B12 deficiency. If you're on acid blockers, you're going to cause calcium deficiency and magnesium deficiency and iron deficiency. So blood pressure medicines cause zinc deficiency, CoQ10 deficiency. There's a whole laundry list of side effects that can come nutritionally from being on medication chronically. And I have a nice diagram of this. If you go over to my YouTube page and you type in drug-induced nutritional deficiencies, you'll find a nice video and a nice chart on this so that you can cross-reference it. But if you're on a lot of medications and you suffer with migraines, you should have the conversation with your doctor. Hey, doc, talk to me about nutritional deficiencies being caused by medications so that at the very least I can be prophylactic and supplement with the deficiencies these meds are causing. And that way you don't wind up with being treated for one problem and that treatment leading or creating a whole other problem that can be a potential trigger again for migraine headache. Hormone disruption, also very, very common. A lot of migraines are triggered around the cycle. So for women premenstrually, and this has to do with hormone imbalances in estrogen and progesterone. Most commonly, it's an estrogen-progesterone ratio imbalance. So what we would say as estrogen dominance, a woman who either has so much exposure to artificial estrogens from her cosmetics, from eating or drinking out of plastics, from pesticide exposures, that in and of itself can create an estrogen dominance, which is a known trigger for migraine headaches around the cycle. Allergies, food allergies, as well as chemical allergies. And food allergies, I mean, gluten is a real common one, as we'll get to next, but, and dairy also, which we will talk about here shortly. But I've seen a number of different types of foods, even healthy foods, what people would perceive to be healthy foods, be migraine triggers. Just remember, one man's food is another man's poison. So you could be getting exposure to a food that you're actually reactive to, and it's one of your migraine triggers. And the only way outside of an elimination diet is to actually get tested. Have your doctor run a test that measures something called delayed hypersensitivity food responses. And in the same test, they can also measure and check for delayed chemical reactions. And so there are a number of different chemicals that we're exposed to on a daily basis. But I see in my patients, I see a lot A lot of them being exposed to some of the chemical compounds in their cosmetics, some of the chemical compounds in their perfumes or in their soaps or detergents or lotions, and those as well can be migraine triggers. If you've ever like walked into some of these popular stores where you go shopping and they're piping some kind of odor or some type of perfume through the store, and every time you go into that store, no matter what city you're in, it always smells the same. That's a chemical, a chemical that a lot of people can be allergic to. And again, these chemicals, most of them are phthalate based, meaning most of them are made uh, or have some degree of phthalates in them. And that's a very, very common migraine trigger. So all that can be tested for so that you know what you need to avoid. But I recommend if you're suffering with migraine headaches, don't wear perfumes and make sure you're using all natural products that don't contain synthetic fragrant agents. Gluten is probably one of the most common migraine triggers, and I have not yet seen, in 16 years of practicing, I have not yet seen a case of somebody suffering with migraines who was able to overcome their migraine headaches without also avoiding gluten. So in my experience, again, this is my experience, 100% of the time, those with migraine headaches need to get gluten out of their diet if they want to make a recovery from those chronic headache exposures. So that means no grain, no wheat, no barley, no rye, no oats, no corn, no rice, no sorghum, no millet. You know, a lot of people follow a traditional gluten-free diet, which is just wheat, barley, and rye free. But you've got to really, if you want to beat migraines, in my experience, you've got to get all the grains out of your diet. Alcohol can be a trigger for several reasons. Wine, beer, hard liquors can all be a trigger because alcohol itself can be a trigger because of its impact on the liver. The liver is one of the ways we detoxify a lot of these chemicals that we can get exposure to. And so, as I was talking about earlier about the different chemicals, so if the liver's compromised because of an overabundance of alcohol coming in, we're now not going to be able to process a lot of different chemicals, and that again, building that up, that can be a migraine trigger. Alcohol can also be a trigger because of sulfites, especially wine. Sulfite's a preservative chemical used. It's used to treat the alcohol so that it preserves the shelf life of the alcohol, especially like I said in wine. And a lot of people react aggressively and develop headaches as a result of wine. Now there are some other compounds in wine that can also trigger headaches as well. So if you're suffering, you might want to avoid the alcohol and get them under control. Sinuses, and it's really more specifically sinus infections that I'm referring to here. So like somebody who has a chronic yeast overgrowth or mold overgrowth in their sinuses. This is actually very common, especially where I'm at in the greater Houston, Texas area, where the most common cause of sinus infections is not bacteria, it's actually mold. So mold infections are super common in the sinuses, and those mold or yeast in the sinuses can actually release different types of chemicals that are neurotoxins that are migraine triggers. Now, bacteria can do it as well. So staph infections are quite common. Pseudomonas infections can be quite common, and then a number of different types of yeast, again, like cladosporium, is real common to create sinus infections in different people. So have your doctor run a nasal culture, and they can rule out any kind of sinus infection, especially if you're a chronic sinus sufferer as well. A lot of migraine sufferers have chronic sinus congestion, have sleep apnea as a result of it, and it's kind of a confluence of problems. So it's like the migraine get triggered, but they also have sinus headaches, sinus pressure headaches, and they also have sleep apnea, which leads to oxygen deprivation, which can also trigger a migraine. So how you can see a confluence of if you added a lot of these different things together, and maybe you had more than one of these problems. And as the age-old adage goes, everybody's entitled to more than one problem. So keep that in mind. Caffeine we talked about. Dairy. We'll round the list out with dairy as one of the top 16 common migraine triggers. There's a number of things in dairy that can trigger or that are a reason for the triggers. One, depending on the kind of dairy you're consuming, the casein protein in dairy for many people with gluten sensitivity issues can mimic gluten. So that's one of the reasons why we might see dairy be a migraine trigger. But a lot of the dairy, you go to the store, you buy the dairy, a lot of the dairy is thickened with something called microbial transglutaminase. It's an enzyme that preserves the shelf life, and it can be a trigger. It triggers leaky gut, leaky brain, which then subsequently can trigger migraine headache. But dairy is also a trigger because of a lot of the hormones that are added to it. So, for example, you probably have seen now on milk, it's becoming more and more popular for milk manufacturers to take out or to not add something called RBGH, recombinant bovine growth hormone, to the dairy. That was something that's being added to the dairy and it can be a trigger, as a chemical trigger for migraine headaches. So a lot of different reasons why dairy might be a trigger. So again, these are the 16 most common migraine triggers that I see clinically in patients that I've seen over the last 16 years of clinical practice and thousands of patients. So if you're a migraineur, if you're suffering with migraine headaches, print this chart out, take a look at it, and start working the diet, start working your environment, and start, working on these things and see if you can't find some type of resolution in your headaches. And I wish you the best. This is Dr. Osborne. We'll see you in the next episode. Make sure you subscribe to the YouTube channel, clicking below, so that you can get more updates on our great web wellness information that we're publishing. So have a great day, and we'll see you in the next episode.